The receipt slipped from the pocket and struck the hardwood floor with a sharp, dry snap. It lay there, a small white rectangle against the dark grain of the wood. I leaned down and picked it up. The date was last Tuesday. That was the night she had claimed to be working late at the office, the night she had sent me a text about a looming deadline and a mountain of paperwork. The location on the slip was a hotel across town, called Hotel Manor, a place I had never visited. I turned the paper over in my hands. The ink was crisp, the details undeniable. I felt the air in the kitchen grow thin. The refrigerator hummed, a low, rhythmic vibration that suddenly sounded like a countdown. I folded the paper, the crease sharp under my thumbnail, and placed it on the kitchen counter. It looked small, almost insignificant, yet it held the weight of every lie she told over the last 6 months. I stood in the center of the room and listened to the house. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, pressing against my chest, thick with the scent of a life that had just been dismantled. I did not move. I did not pace. The lock clicked. The door swung inward, and she stepped into the entryway. Her thumb moved rhythmically across the screen of her phone, a faint, private smile curving her lips. She did not look up. She did not scan the room. She moved past the kitchen counter where the receipt lay, her focus entirely tethered to the digital glow in her palm. I watched her pass within inches of the evidence, yet she remained completely blind to the reality sitting in plain sight. She walked toward the living room, her pace light, unburdened by the weight of the secret she carried. I stood perfectly still. I did not call out. I did not point to the counter. In that moment, the urge to confront her simply evaporated. The anger I expected to feel never arrived. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity settled over me. I watched her disappear into the hallway, still smiling at a screen that held more of her attention than our home ever did. I realized then that I was not standing in a room with my partner. I looked at the empty hallway, and the memories began to surface, no longer blurred by my own denial. I remembered the phone, always face down, always sliding under the pillow the second I entered the bedroom. I remembered the late-night excuses, the vague mentions of office emergencies that left her smelling of unfamiliar perfume. Every instance was a jagged piece of a puzzle I had refused to complete. I recalled the way she pulled her hand away in the hallway, a sharp, reflexive recoil, as if my touch had become an intrusion. I had spent months interpreting these signals as stress or fatigue, crafting excuses to keep the peace. Now, each memory played back with a different meaning. The distance between us had been growing, measured in inches and seconds, while I stood by and watched. The stranger had been here all along, and I had simply been the last one to notice the guest had moved in. I remained in the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. A part of me wanted to storm into the living room, to demand answers, to force a confession that would shatter the quiet. I imagined the scene, the shouting, the defensive lies, the wasted breath on a person who had already checked out of our life. I took a slow breath and let the impulse die. Arguing was a relic of a marriage that still had value. This one was already bankrupt. I turned away from the hallway and began to pace the kitchen floor, my mind shifting gears. If I confronted her now, she would have the advantage of time to hide assets, to twist the narrative, to prepare her own defense. I needed to be surgical. I needed to move in the shadows while she remained distracted by her own secret. The plan began to take shape, cold and precise, replacing the confusion of the last few months with a singular, driving purpose. The next morning, the city air was sharp and cold as I stepped into the law office. The waiting room smelled of floor wax and old paper. I did not hesitate at the reception desk. I walked straight into the inner office and sat across from a man in a gray suit. I did not offer small talk. I placed a heavy, leather-bound folder on the mahogany desk between us. I began to lay out the files, one by one. Bank statements, property deeds, investment records, all organized by date and value. I watched his fingers move across the pages. He stopped, adjusted his glasses, and flipped back to a document I had highlighted. He looked up, his expression shifting. "You have been very thorough," he said, his voice low. I did not smile. I simply nodded and waited. I had come to execute a process. He looked at me, then back at the stack of files, and began to write. The house was a stage for a play I was no longer performing in. While she was out, I moved through the rooms with the efficiency of a ghost. I knew exactly where she kept the secondary files, hidden behind the loose panel in the study. I pulled them out, cross-referencing the numbers with the records I had already secured. My hands did not shake. I spent hours in the quiet, scanning bank statements and property deeds, ensuring every digit matched my own ledgers. I created a shadow archive, a complete map of our shared assets that she did not even know existed. When I heard the front door click open, I was already back in the living room, a book in my lap, the evidence tucked safely away. She walked in, eyes on her phone, completely oblivious to the fact that the life she thought she was controlling had already been dismantled. I closed my book, the weight of the files in the study, feeling like a physical anchor. I had everything I needed. The lawyer slid a fresh stack of documents across the desk. The paper was thick, textured, and heavy. He pointed to the signature lines with a silver pen. I took the pen, the metal cool against my skin. I did not rush. I read every clause, every line of the transfer agreements, and every stipulation regarding the property deeds. Each word was a step toward a life that was finally my own. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed. The ink bled slightly into the grain. I signed again, and again, my hand steady and deliberate. Every stroke was a quiet reclamation. I was not just signing away a marriage. I was dismantling the foundation of a deception. The lawyer watched, his face unreadable, as I finished the final page. I handed the pen back and watched him organize the sheets. I walked out of the office, the weight of the folder in my hand, feeling like a physical anchor of certainty. I returned to the house every evening at 6. The routine was a performance. I hung my coat, walked into the kitchen, and found her already there. The air smelled of roasted garlic and wine. She would talk about her day, her voice light and practiced. She spoke of meetings that never happened and colleagues who did not exist. I listened, my focus entirely on the rhythm of my own breathing. I kept my hands busy, pouring water, cutting bread, and moving my fork across the plate. Every time she lied, I watched the way her eyes darted toward her phone. I nodded at the right intervals. I asked the required questions. I played the part of the husband who knew nothing. The tension in the room was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. She would reach across the table to touch my hand, and I would pull back just enough to avoid contact, claiming I was tired from the commute. I ate the food she prepared, the taste turning to ash in my mouth. When the meal ended, I stood up, cleared the plates, and retreated to the study. She moved through the house with a dangerous kind of ease. She left her phone face up on the kitchen island, a silent testament to her belief that her secrets were safe. I watched her from the doorway as she poured tea, humming a tune, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath her had been pulled away. She talked about a weekend trip she wanted to book, pointing at a travel site on her screen. She spoke of reservations and flights as if the money to pay for them still existed in the accounts I had already locked. I stood there, leaning against the doorframe, and offered a non-committal hum of agreement. It was a strange, cold thrill to witness her confidence. She had no idea that the credit cards she carried were now useless plastic, or that the investments she bragged about were already moved. I turned away, walking toward the hallway, leaving her to her phantom plans. The silence of the house felt different now. It was a countdown. The final morning arrived with a sharp, gray light filtering through the blinds. I woke before the alarm, the silence in the room heavy and absolute. She was still asleep, her breathing steady and rhythmic, completely unaware that this was the last time she would wake up in this house. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I stood up and moved to the closet. I pulled the suitcase from the top shelf, the dust motes dancing in the morning light. I chose only the essentials: a few shirts, a pair of trousers, the documents I had kept hidden in the floorboard. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to make no sound. I folded each item with surgical precision, the fabric crisp under my fingers. I zipped the bag shut, the metallic sound of the slider echoing like a gunshot. I placed the suitcase by the door and looked back at the bed. She shifted, her hand brushing the empty space where I had been. I did not move. I did not flinch. I watched her for a long moment. The preparation was complete. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage. I walked into the living room, the suitcase heavy in my hand. She was already there, curled into the corner of the sofa, her thumb rhythmically scrolling through her phone. The morning light caught the dust in the air, illuminating the space between us. I did not say a word as I approached the coffee table. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the thick, white envelope, and laid it flat on the polished wood. It made a soft, final sound against the surface. I stood there, watching her. She did not look up immediately, her attention still tethered to the screen. I cleared my throat, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet room. "I know about the hotel," I said. The effect was instantaneous. Her thumb froze mid-scroll. The glow of the screen reflected in her eyes, but the movement stopped dead. She did not breathe. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. She looked up, her gaze shifting from the phone to the envelope, and then to me. The silence was the sound of a foundation cracking. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a stark, bloodless gray. She opened her mouth, the familiar lines of a practiced lie already forming on her lips. She began to stammer, her eyes darting toward the window, then back to the envelope, searching for a way to twist the narrative, to cast herself as the victim of a misunderstanding. She started to speak, her voice thin and trembling. "It is not what you think. You have to listen to me." I did not let her finish. I took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until she had to tilt her head back to meet my eyes. I held up a hand, a sharp, silent command that stopped her mid-sentence. The air left her lungs in a ragged gasp. She looked at me, waiting for the usual debate, the cycle of accusations and apologies that had defined our recent months. It did not come. I stood perfectly still, my expression devoid of the anger she expected. In that vacuum of silence, the power shifted. She realized, with a sudden, violent clarity, that her words no longer held weight. Her shoulders slumped, leaving her small and exposed in the center of the room. I turned away from her, the movement fluid and devoid of hesitation. I walked toward the bedroom, my footsteps echoing against the floorboards. I grabbed the suitcase I had packed that morning. It was heavy, packed with the essentials of a life I had already begun to reclaim. I walked back into the living room, passing her without a second glance. She remained frozen on the sofa, her gaze fixed on the envelope I had left behind. I stopped at the threshold of the front door, my hand resting on the cool metal of the handle. "The papers are on the table," I said, my voice steady, devoid of malice. "I am leaving." I did not wait for a response. I did not wait for a plea or a final argument. I pulled the door open, the rush of outside air meeting the stale atmosphere of the house. I stepped across the threshold, the wood creaking beneath my weight. I closed the door behind me, the latch clicking into place with a definitive, final sound. I walked toward the driveway, the gravel crunching under my boots. I did not look back at the windows. I did not look back at the life I had dismantled. I kept walking. The path ahead was entirely my own. I pulled the driver's side door shut, sealing the silence of the car around me. The engine roared to life, a sharp vibration humming through the steering wheel and into my palms. I shifted into drive and pressed the accelerator. The tires gripped the asphalt, pushing me forward, away from the curb, away from the house. In the rearview mirror, a figure stood in the doorway, a small, dark shape against the warm light of the hallway. She did not move. I watched her for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I tilted the mirror up, angling it toward the ceiling, erasing her from my line of sight. The streetlights began to streak past, blurring into long, continuous lines of orange and white. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, hands tight at 10 and 2. The city rushed toward me, a wall of noise and motion that demanded my full attention. Each block I crossed felt like a mile gained. I did not slow down. I did not signal. I stayed in the lane, pushing deeper into the downtown grid, letting the traffic swallow me whole. I pulled into the underground garage, the hum of the engine dying as I killed the ignition. The silence that followed was heavy, clean, and entirely mine. I grabbed the suitcase from the passenger seat. I walked toward the elevator, my boots clicking against the polished concrete floor. The doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 4th floor. As the lift rose, I watched the floor numbers tick upward. The elevator stopped. I stepped out into a hallway that smelled of floor wax and quiet. I reached into my pocket, my fingers finding the cold, jagged teeth of the new keys. I walked to the door at the end of the hall, the metal key sliding into the lock. I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of city lights filtering through the window. I stepped inside. I dropped the suitcase. The sound was dull, final, and absolute. I reached into my pocket again, pulling out the ring of keys. The first chime cut through the quiet of the apartment like a splinter. I looked at the screen. A name I once knew intimately flashed in the darkness. I did not touch it. The phone vibrated again, then again, a rhythmic stuttering against the wood of the coffee table. I picked it up. The notifications piled up in a vertical stack, a digital trail of desperation. Apologies arrived first, long paragraphs of regret that I read without blinking. Then came the demands, sharp and clipped, questioning my whereabouts and my sanity. Finally, the tone curdled into anger, accusations typed in frantic, jagged sentences. I watched the messages scroll, the glow of the display reflecting in my eyes. I did not feel the pull to respond. I did not feel the need to justify my exit. I tapped the edit icon. I selected the first message, then the second, then the entire thread. My thumb hovered over the trash icon for a heartbeat. I pressed down. The screen cleared. The notifications vanished, leaving only the blank, dark interface of a phone that no longer held any power over me. I walked to the window and watched the city lights pulse, knowing that the bridge back to that life had been burned and the ashes were already cold. The morning sun hit the floorboards at 6, a signal for a rhythm I had long forgotten. I started at the gym, the iron plates clanking in a steady, rhythmic cadence. I pushed until my muscles burned, the physical strain clearing the lingering fog of the past. By mid-morning, I was at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating a workspace that was finally mine. I poured my energy into projects I had once sidelined, the work moving with a precision that had been impossible before. The afternoons were for the things I had abandoned. I pulled a wooden easel from the back of the closet, the canvas beneath the dust still blank and waiting. My hands were stiff at first, the brush heavy and unfamiliar. I made a mistake, a streak of blue where I wanted gray, and for a moment, the old frustration flared. I set the brush down, took a breath, and looked at the empty space on the wall. I picked the brush up again. I corrected the line. I stepped out onto the balcony, the night air cool against my skin. Below, the city sprawled out in a grid of amber and white lights, a vast, indifferent landscape that mirrored the clarity in my mind. For weeks, I had carried the phantom weight of a final confrontation, a scene where I would explain, justify, and demand understanding. I stood there, watching the traffic flow like blood through the veins of the streets, and realized that the script I had been writing was unnecessary. Closure was not a conversation. It was not a debate to be won, or a confession to be extracted. It was a decision, made in the quiet of a room, executed in the silence of an exit. I leaned against the cold metal railing, my hands resting on the surface. I thought of the apologies I had deleted, and the questions I had left unanswered. None of them mattered. I breathed in, the air sharp and clean, filling my lungs with the reality of my own autonomy. I was not waiting for a resolution from the outside. The silence in the apartment was absolute. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet that had filled the rooms of my previous life, nor was it the absence of something lost. It was a clean, resonant stillness. I walked through the living room, the floorboards firm beneath my feet, and stopped by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, but they no longer felt like a distraction. They were simply the backdrop to a life I had finally reclaimed. I realized then that the space I had created was not empty. It was a foundation. Every decision I had made, every asset I had secured, and every boundary I had drawn had cleared the debris of the past. The slate was not just wiped clean. It was ready for whatever I chose to write upon it next. I turned away from the window, the weight of the keys in my pocket no longer a burden, but a reminder of my own agency. I was no longer living in the shadow of a lie. I was standing in the center of my own truth. The path forward was mine to define, and for the first time, I was entirely free.